The second prototype of the CG-20 glider made history as the world's first jet-powered military transport aircraft. To make this happen, it was equipped with 2 pairs of General Electric J-47 GE5 turbojet engines. These were borrowed from the Boeing B-47 bomber. Following these extensive modifications, the aircraft was redesignated as the YC123 Alpha. In the first half of 1949, both test aircraft successfully completed their factory trials. But the flight test results made one thing clear. It was just too early to put jet engines on a tactical transport. Flight performance saw only a marginal improvement. Meanwhile, fuel consumption skyrocketed. It jumped 5 to 6 times higher than that of piston engine equivalents. That's exactly why the U.S. Air Force showed far more interest in the piston engine version of the C-123 transport. Chase Aircraft landed a substantial government contract to build 120 of these aircraft. The decision was made to equip them with reliable R-2899W engines. Each engine produced 2,500 horsepower. This production variant became known as the C-123 Bravo. Since production capacity at their Trenton plant was limited, chief designer Michael Stroukoff decided to team up with Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was a renowned shipbuilder and owner of a former Ford aircraft plant in Michigan. Henry's son, Edgar Kaiser, stepped up as the president of their newly formed joint venture. Meanwhile, Stroukoff took the role of vice president. The plan was to set up the main C-123 Bravo production line in Michigan. This was especially important since they had only managed to assemble 5 of these aircraft at the Trenton facility. However, choosing the Kaiser family as business partners turned out to be a fatal mistake for Michael Stroukoff. A major scandal soon broke. It turned out Edgar Kaiser was selling C-119 flying boxcar military transports to the U.S. government at heavily inflated prices. These aircraft were also being assembled at the Michigan plant. When this brazen attempt to overcharge the government was exposed in 1953, Kaiser's contract to build the C-119 was immediately canceled. Caught in the crossfire was the order to build chase aircraft at that same facility. As a result of the scandal, and following a ruling by Congress in August 1954, the production rights for the C-123 Bravo were handed over to Fairchild. Meanwhile, the original creators of the aircraft were left with nothing. They had no government contracts and consequently no funding. By October of that same year, full-scale production of the aircraft began at the Fairchild plant in Hagerstown, Maryland. They got the assembly line up and running in record time. The transition was so smooth that they didn't even have to pause or slow down C-119 production at the same site. From then on, Fairchild's experienced engineering team took charge of upgrading the aircraft. As a first major step toward modernizing it in 1954, engineers looked into installing Allison T56 turboprop engines. While the idea showed great promise, it never made it off the drawing board. Compared to the early prototypes, the production version of the aircraft received a number of key upgrades. The aircraft was fitted with a larger vertical stabilizer featuring a squared-off tip. It also received significantly wider cargo doors and slightly reshaped cockpit side windows. On top of that, the aircraft received a more robust anti-icing system. Engine access for maintenance was also made much easier for ground crews. The old external radio antennas were swapped out for new, more aerodynamic ones. The wings deserve special mention. They were incredibly rugged. This later allowed crews to easily add underwing hardpoints for 450-gallon drop tanks and auxiliary jet engines. Factory testing of the production C-123 Bravo kicked off in Hagerstown on September 1, 1954. This was just 11 months after Fairchild secured the production rights. By October 6th, the first 2 production aircraft were officially handed over to the military. They were then flown out to Edwards Air Force Base for further Army evaluation. The acceptance testing program was rigorous, logging well over 100 test flights. During these flights, it became clear that all the design changes they had made were completely justified. They were really paying off in real-world conditions. The first squadron equipped with the brand-new C-123s was based out of Ardmore Air Force Base in Oklahoma. They reached initial operational capability in the summer of 1955. It did not take long for these new tactical transports to prove themselves during the massive exercise Sagebrush. There, they took on incredibly demanding missions. They successfully flew simulated casualties out of rough, unimproved dirt strips near the mock front lines around Barksdale Air Force Base. The Air Force was highly impressed with their new airlifter. They quickly dubbed it the ultimate frontline tactical transport. The military especially loved its unique ability to rapidly move troops and equipment directly into the combat zone. Loading and unloading the aircraft was incredibly efficient, all thanks to that spacious rear cargo ramp. On top of that, the transport had fantastic short-field performance. It could easily take off and land on unimproved dirt strips, even on freshly secured bridgeheads. This was not to mention airdropping troops and gear directly over the drop zone. Once the C-123 entered service, the United States Army gained unprecedented capabilities for moving forces across tactical distances. That is really when the term air mobility became a cornerstone of their operational thinking. The C-123 could carry significantly more troops than the largest operational Army helicopter of the time, the Piasecki workhorse, also known as the Flying Banana. It also got them to their objective a whole lot faster. The only real complaint actually came from the Air Force Surgeon General. He pointed out an issue during hard landings on short, rough assault strips. When pilots were flying steep approaches and throwing the props into reverse pitch for rapid braking, wounded soldiers strapped into litters were experiencing excessive G-forces. By late 1955, the decision was made to upgrade the existing fleet of C-123 Bravo aircraft. They installed special underwing pylons to carry 2 drop tanks, with each holding about 450 gallons of fuel. Following this upgrade, these transports were given the new designation of C-123 Charlie. Interestingly, the engineers did a great job thinking through the safety systems. If an in-flight emergency occurred, pilots could instantly jettison those external drop tanks. Along with the tanks, the rear sections of the engine nacelles could be jettisoned as well. These sections housed the main fuel tanks. To trigger this emergency release, all the pilot had to do was hit a set of toggle switches. These were conveniently located on the overhead panel in the cockpit. Meanwhile, the brilliant aircraft designer Michael Stroukoff finally managed to get some justice after a long legal battle. He won a massive settlement from his former business partners, walking away with around $2 million. That money allowed him to stay in the game and keep designing aircraft. Only this time, he was the president and chief designer of his own newly formed company. Looking to catch the military's eye and secure some lucrative new contracts, Stroukoff worked tirelessly to improve his C-123. The designer's ultimate goal was to give the aircraft the ability to take off from even shorter fields. He also wanted it to land in the most rugged conditions imaginable, vastly expanding its operational footprint. In that same year, 1955, Fairchild worked closely with Stroukoff Aircraft on a really fascinating experiment. They wanted to improve the Provider's climb rate. To do this, they mounted 2 small, lightweight J-44 turbojet engines out on the wingtips of a standard production airframe. Each of these put out about 1,000 pounds of thrust. Plus, when the pilots deployed the flaps, some of the thrust from these jets was directed over the wing to control the airflow. This significantly improved low-speed handling. The military was blown away by the results. Before, a fully loaded aircraft at sea level could only climb at a rate of 150 feet per minute. But with the new jet pods, that number shot up to over 500 feet per minute. And this was with the airplane's total takeoff weight sitting at nearly 66,800 pounds. 13,000 pounds of that was well over its standard maximum gross weight. To make it even more impressive, during the test, one of the main radial engines was intentionally shut down. Its propeller was feathered to reduce drag. When all 4 engines were running at once, the airplane lifted off after a takeoff roll of just 2,630 feet. A huge bonus was that these jet pods ran on the exact same avgas as the main engines. Because of this, they did not have to complicate the fuel system. And to keep them from creating excess drag when they were shut down, their intakes were covered by special doors. These doors comically looked like human eyelids. Thanks to this extra jet thrust, the airplane accelerated much faster. It could also achieve a much steeper climb out. This kind of capability was a literal lifesaver. It helped when you had to get airborne fast under enemy fire from some unimproved strip on the front lines. It was also vital when taking off from an ice runway in the harsh Arctic. This innovation was considered incredibly successful. Real-world experience only confirmed how effective it was. In the late 1950s, 10 of these aircraft got an even bigger upgrade. They were fitted with retractable skis as part of the universal panto-based landing gear system. These northern variants were designated the C-123 Juliet. They were sent out to serve mostly in Alaska. Up there, they operated off glaciers and hauled supplies to remote polar stations. This finally sent the old C-47s into a well-deserved retirement. Right around the same time, engineers were hard at work. They were trying to turn the C-123 into a carrier onboard delivery aircraft for the Navy. This ambitious project got a rather unusual nickname, the Flying Lighter. The designers envisioned that this aircraft would deliver up to 17,600 pounds of supplies, fuel, or spare parts. It would transport these to the deck of a strike carrier over a range of about 1,200 nautical miles. There was also an alternate option. The airplane could haul 8,800 pounds of cargo over an even greater distance. It could reach all the way out to 2,100 nautical miles. And technically speaking, this was completely feasible. When they widened the flight decks on the Essex and Midway-class carriers, this transport could have easily taken off and landed right on them. This is especially true if it was fitted with auxiliary turbojets for takeoff thrust. In that case, it wouldn't even need a catapult for launch or a resting gear for recovery. Though just to be safe, the engineers still designed a heavy-duty tailhook attached to a reinforced aft fuselage. As for the even larger Forrestal-class supercarriers, the story gets even crazier. During one experiment, a much heavier C-130 Hercules successfully landed on and took off from the deck of one of these giants. And it did it without any arresting gear or takeoff assist. But politics got in the way, specifically the long-standing and pretty bitter rivalry between the U.S. Air Force and the Navy. Thanks to this inter-service squabbling, the C-123 never made it to the fleet. Instead, the Navy went with Grumman's C-1 Trader logistics aircraft. To put it mildly, its performance specs were a lot more modest, but it had one absolutely critical advantage for the Navy. It had folding wings. This made it easy to stow the aircraft away on a cramped carrier hangar deck. Meanwhile, the chief designer Michael Stroukoff wasn't resting on his laurels. He worked tirelessly to make his design as independent from paved runways as possible. In early 1955, he came up with a totally unique system. With it, the Avitruck transport was supposed to become a true go-anywhere aircraft. The idea was that the airplane could safely take off and land literally anywhere. It could handle unprepared dirt strips, water, ice, snow, swamps, or even loose sand. To pull this off, they developed an innovative universal landing gear system called Panto Base. This setup looked absolutely sci-fi for its time. It featured standard wheels with special low-pressure tires. It also had heavy-duty hydroskis that retracted in flight, and a completely sealed lower fuselage. On top of that, they mounted special floats on the wingtips to keep the aircraft balanced on the water. To test this out, they took a standard production C-123. After some heavy modifications, this aircraft was redesignated as the YC123 Echo. Thanks to its high-volume fuselage, the aircraft could easily float. It only drew 2.5 feet of water. Out on the water, it handled just like a true flying boat. The specially shaped nose allowed it to confidently slice through the waves. At the same time, the retractable hydroskis did a fantastic job lifting the hull clear of the surface during the takeoff roll. In early August 1955, the YC-123 Echo headed out to a naval base near Philadelphia to show off what it could do. And it was an incredible sight. The airplane landed on a standard concrete runway and took off again. Then it deployed its hydroskis in flight and touched down smoothly right on the surface of the Delaware River. After that, it effortlessly accelerated across the water, took to the skies, and headed right back to the paved runway. The U.S. Air Force representatives were so blown away by this demo, they immediately signed a contract for an initial batch of 6 aircraft. Unfortunately, thanks to shifting military priorities, that contract was canceled shortly after. In December 1955, at the military's request, the C-123 was officially named the Provider. Here's an interesting fact for you. Looking at its first few years in service, this aircraft actually proved to be the safest and least accident-prone airplane in all of American military aviation. Just imagine this. By mid-1956, one air group flying Providers had racked up over 14,000 flight hours. And in all those hours, they didn't record a single accident. They did not have even a minor mishap or an in-flight emergency. That is an absolutely incredible track record for reliability. In early 1956, the first 3 C-123 squadrons were deployed to Europe. To get there, the Providers had to make a challenging transatlantic crossing. They took off from Goose Bay in Canada, made a refueling stop in Iceland, and then successfully touched down at Prestwick in Scotland. Once in Europe, these reliable transports joined a U.S. Air Force Air Division and were based in France. Their main mission was providing a daily airlift. They hauled spare parts and critical military cargo between U.S. bases in Germany and the U.K. Starting in 1956, Michael Stroukoff focused on developing a heavily modified version of the aircraft. The new project was designated the YC124. Its main feature was a significantly stretched fuselage. This allowed for a much larger cargo hold and an increased payload capacity. The U.S. government backed this development with a $4 million contract. This funded the construction of 3 of these experimental giants. This was the largest aircraft Chase had ever built. To give you an idea of its size, the aircraft had a maximum takeoff weight of nearly 90,400 pounds. It had a payload of about 25,000 pounds. Production C-134s were slated to feature an innovative boundary layer airflow control system on the wing. They also included a universal landing gear system known as Panto Base. To maintain performance and maneuverability on par with the older C-123, the new aircraft was equipped with more powerful Wright R3350-89 duplex Cyclone engines. Each of these cranked out 3,500 horsepower and was paired with massive 4-blade Aero Products propellers. Overall, the exterior of the new transport looked a lot like the C-123. However, to improve directional stability, engineers made the vertical tail taller. They also added 2 small auxiliary end plates to the tips of the horizontal stabilizer. The real highlight of the aircraft, though, was its complex boundary layer control system. It worked in a really clever way. It simultaneously sucked air from under the inboard flap sections and blew it over the outboard sections. The flaps themselves could extend to 60 degrees, giving the aircraft excellent low-speed handling. This entire system was powered by 2 separate French-made Turbomeca Aspen 2 compressors. Each put out 400 horsepower and was mounted completely inside the wings. Down the line, the plan was to swap these out for American Westinghouse J-30 turbojets. Thanks to this technology, the wing lift literally doubled. For future production aircraft, Chief Designer Michael Stroukoff wanted to go all in on an even more efficient system. This new system would draw air across the entire wingspan. At the Chase plant in Trenton, New Jersey, 3 of these aircraft were built. The first prototype featured standard-wheeled landing gear, though it was heavily upgraded. Instead of single wheels, it used dual main wheels with low-pressure tires. The nose gear was also fitted with 1 massive wheel. The other 2 aircraft received the innovative Panto Base universal landing gear. The first prototype took to the skies for its initial test flights in December 1956. These took place at the local Mercer County Airport. Right away, the aircraft demonstrated absolutely phenomenal short takeoff and landing performance. This was despite the fact that U.S. Air Force representatives initially forbade the pilots from using the boundary layer control system. The crew had to wait until the aircraft had logged at least 6 hours of flight time. But even without that system engaged, the empty aircraft lifted off after a takeoff roll of just 410 feet. And the landing roll, using reverse pitch on the props, was even shorter. It was a mere 400 feet. Financially, however, things weren't going well. By July, development of the C-134 had already burned through what was a massive sum for the time. That sum was $10.5 million. Meanwhile, the second and third aircraft still weren't finished. One was 90% assembled, and the other was sitting at just 70% complete. Running out of cash, the factory actually had to shut down for 2 whole weeks. During this time, Michael Stroukoff was desperately negotiating with the military over at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He managed to convince them to provide an additional $2 million, but even that fell critically short of what was needed to finish the work. The company was forced to lay off a chunk of its workforce, and by that fall, the C-134 program was canceled for good. The official reasons given were massive cost overruns and the fact that the design was rapidly becoming obsolete. The reality was that American military transport aviation was evolving toward higher payloads and longer ranges. The era of piston engines was quickly fading into the past. Much more powerful turboprop and jet technologies were already taking over. Despite the military backing out, the Independent Airlines Association took an interest in the C-134. The numbers told a compelling story. If you equipped the aircraft with 4 modern Rolls-Royce Dart Mark 510 or Lycoming T-55 turboprop engines, operating costs would fall to just 6 cents per ton-mile. This perfectly fit the strict requirements of commercial cargo haulers. Inspired by this, Stroukoff quickly put together a preliminary design for a 4-engine version of the C-134. Those fuel-efficient Dart turboprops, putting out 1,600 shaft horsepower each, were expected to push the airplane to a cruising speed of nearly 250 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the standard payload would be right around 25,000 pounds. The maximum payload was projected at just over 35,000 pounds. It would carry roughly 12,000 pounds of jet fuel. This allowed the aircraft to cover a distance of nearly 1,500 miles unrefueled. It all sounded incredibly promising, but unfortunately, the project never went further than numbers on paper. As for its predecessor, the famous Provider transport, production finally wrapped up at the end of 1958. According to official records, Fairchild built a total of 302 examples of the legendary C-123 over its entire production run. In 1962, the United States Army issued new requirements for a tactical transport aircraft. The military needed a transport capable of hauling up to 20,000 pounds of cargo. It also needed to be able to operate out of short, unimproved dirt airstrips. The proven C-123 Provider seemed perfectly suited for this ambitious role. There was just one major problem. The original B model suffered from a marginal initial climb rate right off the runway. Engineers came up with a clever solution. They decided to mount an extra pair of small General Electric J-85 turbojets under the wings. Each was putting out 2,850 pounds of thrust. To cut down the landing roll as much as possible, they installed a drag chute housing in the tail section. The landing gear was upgraded too. They widened the track, and from then on, the oversized low-pressure tires remained partially exposed to the slipstream when retracted. Over the summer of 1962, Fairchild converted a C-123 Bravo specifically for testing. This upgraded prototype was designated the YC123 Hotel. By mid-August, it had already kicked off an extensive flight test program at Edwards Air Force Base. The Provider's main competitor in this contract competition was the highly successful Canadian DHC-5 Buffalo transport from de Havilland. The U.S. Army actually purchased 5 of these aircraft for testing. While the Canadian aircraft had excellent takeoff and landing performance, it noticeably fell short of the upgraded Provider in a few key metrics. It carried less payload, featured a smaller cargo hold, and had a lower rate of climb. However, the Buffalo eventually found its calling. It saw heavy use by American and Australian forces during the Vietnam War. It seemed like Fairchild had the victory in the bag, but red tape got in the way. Under U.S. military regulations at the time, the Army simply didn't have the authority to directly purchase fixed-wing aircraft developed for the Air Force. Because of these bureaucratic hurdles, no new orders for the H-model Provider ever materialized, which was a shame because engineers had planned a series of major design improvements. These included adding spoilers for better roll control and installing powerful double-slotted flaps. Army leadership also turned down an alternative pitch from Fairchild. The company offered to heavily modify the F-27 civilian airliner, but turning it into a true frontline tactical transport would have meant rebuilding the aircraft almost from scratch. Despite these setbacks, the idea of upgrading the legacy C-123s to a standard similar to the H model didn't just disappear. Everything changed as the Vietnam War escalated. Pacific Air Force's command urgently needed reliable transport aircraft. They needed planes capable of tactical airlift and short takeoffs and landings on austere jungle airstrips. By that time, the YC-123 Hotel prototype had already gone through combat evaluation in South Vietnam in 1963. There, it once again demonstrated outstanding performance. To kick off a massive retrofit program for the fleet, Air Force leadership had to scramble to rework their entire budget. It got to the point where the military had to make deep cuts to funding for even high-priority programs, like upgrading the legendary B-52 strategic bombers. To keep conversion costs down, engineers decided to scrap most of the complex innovations they had planned for the H model. They only kept the absolute essentials on the aircraft. These were the auxiliary turbojets on underwing pylons and a modern anti-skid braking system for the landing gear. Thanks to these brakes and reverse thrust from the propellers, the aircraft's landing roll was brought down to under 720 feet. This kind of STOL performance completely satisfied military command. The upgraded transports received a new designation, the C-123 Kilo. The first modernized aircraft officially rolled out of the Hagerstown factory on August 26, 1966. Sensing a massive opportunity to restart series production of the Provider, Fairchild quickly drew up another proposal. They used the C-123 Hotel as a baseline. Then they swapped out the old radial engines for powerful General Electric T-64 turboprops. This new variant was designated the C-123 Lima. The manufacturer launched an aggressive marketing campaign. They stressed at every turn that this aircraft was tailor-made for the harsh conditions in Vietnam. But this time, the Air Force didn't show any interest at all. And, as the bitter experience of later regional conflicts in the second half of the 20th century would prove, the military was right. It turned out that relying on turboprop engines for aircraft constantly exposed to small arms and anti-aircraft fire was a major liability. These engines were far too vulnerable to damage, and their combat survivability under heavy fire proved to be very poor. In the spring of 1967, specifically in April, the first batch of 76 C-123 Kilo aircraft arrived in Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, the Provider became a true flying workhorse. Thanks to their phenomenal short-field capabilities, taking off and landing on incredibly short airstrips, they were heavily used for moving infantry, light armor, and artillery. On top of that, these aircraft played a crucial role. They helped in the rapid medevac of wounded troops directly from combat zones. Because of its unique mixed power plant, the transport quickly earned a highly accurate nickname among American troops: two turning, two burning. Given the harsh realities of the war, where paved and secure runways were in critically short supply, the aircraft proved absolutely indispensable. It could pull off missions that no other U.S. military transport could handle. Even the C-130 Hercules, famous for its ruggedness, often had to sit on the sidelines while the Provider got the job done. Michael Stroukoff's design regularly had to touch down in truly extreme conditions. Pilots masterfully wrestled the planes down onto narrow, carved-out dirt strips. They also landed on improvised jungle clearings that had literally been blasted out by heavy bombs. And often, this all happened under heavy Viet Cong fire. Spare parts on the front lines were in disastrously short supply. This was especially true when it came to components for the radial engines. Because of this severe shortage, base mechanics had to resort to cannibalization. The most heavily damaged aircraft were permanently grounded. They were slowly stripped for parts just to keep the rest of the fleet in the air. To maximize their rate of climb right after takeoff, crews stripped their aircraft down to the absolute bare minimum. This helped them escape the deadly range of enemy anti-aircraft and small arms fire as quickly as possible. The heavy rear cargo ramp and landing gear doors were removed without a second thought. Sometimes they even went as far as yanking out the standard canvas troop seats. U.S. Army engineer and Vietnam veteran John Mellinger shared a vivid memory of one of his flights. Back in 1970, 65 new recruits needed to be flown out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base. They were heading to a forward dirt strip near the town of Chu Lai. When the transport taxied in to pick them up, they found the cargo bay completely stripped bare. The only thing rigged up inside was a simple green nylon cargo net. The rear ramp and doors were completely gone too. After firing up and running through the run-up checks, the pilot came over the intercom. He just said, "Grab a hold and hang on tight." Then he hauled the heavy transport into the sky at an incredibly steep angle. Looking out through the gaping hole where the metal ramp used to be, you could see the runway rapidly dropping away below. Scared to death, the new recruits, cherries and army slang, they clung to that nylon netting for dear life. They held on with their arms and legs just to keep from falling out. According to Mellinger, those fears were entirely justified. There had been horrific incidents where the ramp was missing during these max performance takeoffs. Soldiers had actually lost their grip, fallen out, and plummeted to their deaths. One particular C-123 Bravo was specially modified into an electronic intelligence and targeting platform. This was part of a massive, highly classified operation to establish the so-called McNamara line. It was an ambitious plan aimed at choking off vital enemy supply routes along the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The aircraft was packed with avionics that were incredibly advanced for the time. It could remotely pick up data from specialized acoustic sensors. U.S. aircraft were dropping these sensors by the dozen over the dense jungle canopy along the route. On top of that, the plane carried an ignition detector. This device was capable of picking up the electrical signals from enemy truck engines, even when they were hidden deep under the jungle canopy. Other United States military transports were flying similar reconnaissance missions at the time. These included well-known aircraft like the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar, the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, and the classic Lockheed C-121 Super Constellation. The war had its share of close air support aircraft too. Two special NC-123 Kilo gunships operated in the skies over Vietnam. They were equipped with an advanced infrared night observation and targeting system. Their primary firepower came from twin 50-caliber M3 machine guns mounted on each side. Probably the darkest chapter in the Provider's combat history during the Vietnam War was the spraying of the highly toxic defoliant Agent Orange over the jungle. This took place stretching into the early 70s. Officially, the American military did it to clear the dense tropical canopy. This was intended to deny Viet Cong fighters reliable cover. But it was obvious to anyone paying attention that this was a full-scale chemical campaign, not just defoliation. Traditional conventional tactics had proven ineffective. Exactly how many people died from exposure to this chemical on the ground remains unknown to this day. We are talking about thousands of casualties, including both Vietnamese and Americans. The environmental impact of this disaster can still be felt today. Many American infantrymen and rangers were never warned about the aerial spraying. They had absolutely no idea about the chemical's extreme toxicity. Unknowingly, they were inhaling critical doses of the poison. Many suffered severe long-term health issues. Some were left permanently disabled, and others ultimately died from the exposure. The same tragic fate befell many of the air crews and ground personnel. They were assigned to the 44 YC123 Bravo and YC123 Kilo aircraft that were specially converted to spray Agent Orange. The defoliation equipment itself was almost identical to standard agricultural crop dusting systems, and it lacked proper sealing. Because of this, the chemical often leaked directly into the cabin. It also dripped from the spray booms while the aircraft were parked on the ramp. Mechanically, the setup worked like this. The delivery plumbing for the chemical was routed deep inside the wings. This fed into spray nozzles mounted externally on the underside of the wingtips. Throughout the entire Vietnam War, around 50 C-123s were lost. Most of them were written off due to non-combat incidents or as a result of indirect enemy fire on the air bases. This figure also includes cannibalized airframes. These were stripped for parts to keep other airplanes flying. In the final stages of the conflict, the United States administration shifted its strategy toward the Vietnamization of the war. During this time, about 10 providers were transferred to the South Vietnamese Air Force. Around the same time, a few more of these aircraft were sent to Thailand. Beyond the United States, the C-123 also saw service with other air forces. These included Saudi Arabia, South Vietnam, Venezuela, and Thailand. Its first ever export delivery took place back in April 1957. At that time, 6 aircraft were handed over to the Royal Saudi Air Force. A number of airframes were left behind and effectively abandoned to their fate in South Vietnam. If you do not count those, a total of 24 of these aircraft were exported to foreign operators. As for the creator of this aircraft, the rest of Michael Stroukoff's life turned out to be fairly tragic. He was a resilient man who weathered some heavy setbacks. He had to deal with dishonest business partners and total indifference toward his promising technical innovations. This was even though they would be incredibly useful today. Stroukoff pushed hard to get them implemented, but it was all to no avail. Then came the personal tragedies. the death of his beloved wife, and complete financial ruin. Still, life went on. At the age of 70, Stroukoff married for a second time and even became a father. It is worth pointing out that immigrants from the former Russian Empire weren't always fully embraced by the American aviation industry. The real exceptions were Igor Sikorsky, whose genius practically built the U.S. helicopter industry from scratch, and Alexander Kartveli. But neither Alexander de Seversky nor Michael Stroukoff were ever able to take their rightful place in the pantheon of great American aircraft designers. Michael Stroukoff passed away in Princeton, New Jersey at the age of 90. He died in poverty, completely and undeservedly forgotten. The aircraft's military career came to an end in the summer of 1982. At that time, the last U.S. Air Force squadron finally replaced its aging providers with the more modern and capable C-130 Hercules transports. After being officially retired from service, the C-123s weren't just sent to the scrapyard. Instead, they were flown out to the Mojave Desert for long-term storage. Most of these aircraft were still in excellent mechanical condition. They had plenty of service life left on both the airframes and the engines. Here is an interesting detail. Before sending the aircraft to the boneyard, the Air Force pulled the auxiliary jet engines off the C-123 Kilo models. They left just the empty engine pods or nacelles attached to the wings. As time went by, many of these airplanes got a second lease on life. They were sold off to private operators. Their drab military camouflage was swapped out for bright civilian paint jobs. These old warbirds kept right on flying in civilian roles. We also have to mention the Provider's Hollywood success. Thanks to its rugged, photogenic looks, the Provider became a genuine movie star. It showed up in over 24 films. For example, in The Living Daylights, the C-123 acted as a stand-in for a C-130 Hercules. That Hercules, in turn, was supposed to be playing a Soviet Antonov An-12. You can also spot the Provider in famous movies like Terminal Velocity, Air America, Stormcatcher, and Con Air. In Stormcatcher, they actually turned the Provider into a full-blown missile carrier. They built bomb bay doors into the belly of the fuselage. According to the plot, these doors were used to launch an ALCM. Instead of a standard warhead, it was equipped with a sci-fi Typhoon generator. And in Terminal Velocity, they spectacularly dropped a luxury Cadillac out the back of the Provider's open tail ramp. This was followed by a highly cinematic landing on an unimproved dirt strip. During touchdown, the pilots threw the props into reverse. This kicked up massive, dramatic clouds of dust for the camera. In the cult classic action movie Die Hard 2, the Provider played a military transport from a fictional Latin American republic. It was carrying a corrupt general to face justice. For this shoot, they took the original engines off the C-123. They hung 4 massive fake engine nacelles right on the wings to imitate jet turbines. At the end of the scene, this airplane is blown up in a spectacular explosion. Bruce Willis's character escapes the grenade-filled cockpit using an ejection seat. Real pilots who flew the Provider probably laughed out loud at that part. This is because this aircraft never actually had those kinds of escape systems. Despite all the Hollywood fiction, this was a well-engineered, reliable, incredibly rugged, and truly beautiful aircraft. Thanks to its durability, this handsome workhorse still takes to the skies even today. Finally, it is worth acknowledging the tactical niche for a light military transport aircraft capable of operating near the front lines. This role was left completely empty in the U.S. military inventory after the Provider was ultimately retired. The legendary C-130 Hercules turned out to be too large and runway-dependent for those kinds of missions. At the same time, specialized transports like the Boeing YC-14 and McDonnell Douglas YC-15 were developed in the 1960s and 1970s. However, they never made it past the experimental prototype stage. Interestingly, Soviet aircraft built for a roughly similar role, such as the An-32, An-72, and An-74, actually saw full-scale production, unlike their American competitors. Faced with the challenge of keeping frontline troops supplied by air and getting the wounded out fast, the U.S. military found a solution in the 1990s. They adopted a heavily modernized small tactical transport, the G-222, designating it the C-27 Spartan.